1880s, the Gilded Age. It was the time when the world experienced an enormous economic growth, development, and prosperity. At that time, the second industrial revolution was at the high point. Even though America was just recovering from the trauma that came from their Civil War, which started in 1861 and ended in 1865. Europe, just like America, was experiencing an exceptional industrial development and economic growth. During that time, railroads became prevalent for faster and convenient means of travel across Africa and in some other fast developing countries at that time. Especially for Europe and America, the 1880s was characterized by economic growth and prosperity, with the emergence of modern cities, corporations, franchises, brands, and especially the introduction of the skyscrapers. While all those developments were happening in the world and other continents rising, guess what was happening in Africa? The transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was the only booming business in the continent of Africa, which the Dutch, the France, the Spain, and even the Portuguese all took part of. But in spite of the things that we knew about these countries that I just mentioned, there are countries who were at the forefront of the transatlantic slave trade, even before it became a global phenomenon. Now, number one is the Portuguese. For the first time, it was the Portuguese who took the first slave out of Africa. As early as 1400, the Portuguese had already captured and transported the enslaved Africans to Europe and America. By 1490s, they were already transporting 3,000 enslaved Africans to Portugal and Spain. The second is the Spanish. Before the 15th century, the Spanish had already begun taking enslaved Africans from Europe to America in 1503. And by 1518, they became bold enough to be transporting slaves and shipping African slaves from Africa to Europe. The transatlantic slave trade started as early as 14th century, which involved the transportation of African slaves to America, and it lasted until the 19th century. It was basically a practice where human beings are being imported and exported like commodities, which was also known as the triangular trade. The triangular trade was a three-part economic system or three-legged economic system invented by the Europeans, which involved the exchange of goods between Europe, Africa, and Americas. The triangular trade involved the exchange of finished goods, the manufactured goods, with the enslaved people of Africa, and the shipment of plantation crops and products of America back to Europe. Breaking this to the layman's understanding so that you can be able to really understand what this means. It simply means the sending of European manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, where they were traded for slaves. Then the slaves were transported from Africa to America to be sold. The triangular trade was inspired by the Europeans' needs for raw materials, the Americans' need for labor, the Africans' need for material gain and money. As the name implies, only three components made the triangular trade to be effective. One is the captive African, two is the Middle Passage, three is the return cargo. And we're going to break them down for you to understand what they really mean. Captive Africans. These West African people are captured and exchanged for trade goods like the guns and brandy and whiskey. The Middle Passage. These West Africans were captured and transported to North America and to the West Indies to be sold. Return cargo. Rum and sugar were taken from this colony and then returned to the United Kingdom to be sold. Now, the misconception and the truth about the African transatlantic slave trade. Now, we all know that most of the Western countries were at the forefront of the slave trade. It's not a new thing and it's not a hidden thing at the time. But the truth is that they were not the first to start it. Because most people in the modern world today used to think that the Portuguese and the Europeans were the ones who introduced slave trade to Africa. But if you ask if they were the one who started the transatlantic slave trade, I would say yes. And historically, yes. Obviously, they were not the one who introduced or invented slave trade in Africa. Because the word slave trade and transatlantic slave trade are two different words with different meanings. So I think it's good we remember that. Because even before the Portuguese arrived in Africa in 1400s, Africans were already engaging in slave trade by selling themselves among themselves. The only difference was that Africans were not crossing the Atlantics to get their own slaves or to exchange their own slaves, because simply they were just Africans. Their trade were only carried out in their domains. And secondly, in Africa at that time, someone can only be condemned as a slave if that person had already been condemned by the society. Like thieves, criminal, fornicators, or any person who has committed any kind of crime or taboo in the local African society. However, it is generally done with condition. But when the Europeans showed up in Africa, the trajectory in which slaves were traded drastically changed. Because first, the Europeans had already realized their needs for slaves. And secondly, it was difficult to stop because the Africans couldn't say no since they needed the incentives they received from the Europeans after selling their own brothers to the white men. Now, while money was the main motivation through which the native Africans enslaved their own brothers to the Europeans, the great desire to exude dominance and supremacy over their clansmen also played a larger role. That was because it was only the men of prominence and influence that had the ability to capture and enslave others. A mere commoner of an African community did not have such advantage unless he was hired or employed by an influential man to do so. The effects of the transatlantic slave trade on Africa. The transatlantic slave trade obviously had a negative influence on the African continent and also on Africans. And its effects are still felt even in today's world. Back in the 1880s, the effects of the transatlantic slave trade were more physical, because you could physically see how people were forced to work, being forced to do what they don't want to do, being forced to lay down and being flogged and being molested. But in today's world, the effects of the transatlantic slave trade is more psychological to the modern generation. The transatlantic slave trade ruined Africa because in those days it instigated so many wars among Africans, and which led to the loss of millions of young Africans. On today's, they estimated about 12.5 million people who lost their lives during the transatlantic slave trade. And even today, it is psychologically devastating to realize that your forefathers were treated like animals and officially sold like commodities by some supreme beings. For me, as an African, it is emotionally draining, because only the thought of what Africans went through during those times was enough to strip off someone's confidence as an African, because it was a very shameful thing. That is why I personally think that African continent especially deserve some form of apologies from the rest of the world, especially Europe and America. The transatlantic slave trade was a global phenomenon that affected the world, in which its enormous impact can never be erased in the human history. As a matter of fact, whenever you see a black person or black people as part of the native in the white man's country, as we have the black Americans in America, be rest assured that if you trace their ancestry so well, they were brought by the transatlantic slave trade. Now take America as an example. America is made up of white people and black people just because of the transatlantic slave trade. That's just an example, even though it applies in so many other countries. There wouldn't have been anything called the Black Americans if there was nothing like the transatlantic slave trade. Or African American. The black people made up of the most of the population, and they are vibrantly contributing in the development and the growth of the economy. The impact and the influence of these black people in the white man's country were almost undeniable, which stretches across all the spheres of human endeavors, such as music, science, technology, business, and religion. Again, I think the transatlantic slave trade also abated the furiousness of racism. The transatlantic slave trade has already done well to manage to find ways to abate the furiousness of racism in already developed countries. This may sound a little sarcastic because it is not obviously what the world is thinking about right now. But just as every dark cloud has a silver lining, if we can look closely enough, the traumatic experience of the transatlantic slave trade left with us its brighter side, which we have not realized yet. Now think about this. If most of the black people in the white man's country today still face racism and some kind of prejudice in subtle and some obvious ways, even though when they have their ancestors in those foreign countries, like we have the African American living in the United States. Now imagine how severe racism would have become if those Western countries never had black race as part of their origin or history. Honestly, it would have been brutal, because the concept of black would have become something very strange to the world. But somehow and in some way, the severity of racism has been abated, because the black as people are now somehow indispensable part of the world. And even in the white man's world, even when the world has always wanted to discriminate, to create a world of the black and the white, the transatlantic slave trade beforehand had already made the world to mix up in such a way no one had ever expected. This video was inspired by my book, The Mind of a Hero. So if you would like to get the book, I will keep the link at the description below. You can visit my website and to get a copy, whether the soft copy or the hard copy. Thank you so much, and may God bless you. Please help me to click the like button and to subscribe to this channel. It won't cost you any money, it won't cost you any dime. Only click that subscribe button and to like the video. All I have right now is to say bye bye, and I will meet you again in the next video.